A huge thank you to patron New Wave Nancy for suggesting today's video topic. If you want to suggest a topic for next Wednesday's Name Explain video, all you have to do is support Name Explain on Patreon for $1 a month. Find out more by visiting patreon.com/nameexplain, which we linked down below. Anyway, once upon a time, newspapers were the go-to source for many people in understanding what's happening in the wider world. They were the hub of information, current events, weather for the day, sports scores, and even comic strips and games. Daily newspapers once reigned supreme. These days, that isn't quite the case. The online world and the way it can pass on news to us has radically changed how we all process the global affairs of our planet. For better and worse, I suppose. This has left physical newspapers somewhat in the dust, though the makers of those newspapers are seemingly doing just fine, as many popular news websites are the ones belonging to those paper makers. This means that for those newspaper makers, their agendas still hold a huge amount of influence on the global stage. And for us, the names of many of these newspapers are still alive and kicking too. What's weird about the sites still using the names of these papers is that many of these paper names have their roots in the physical, tangible medium they were once predominantly existing in. Newspaper names were odd things. While many across the globe have fairly unique names, a lot of them, especially papers that cover smaller local areas, have names which feature reoccurring words in them. There's this selection of words which have culminated over the course of newspaper history, which have come to be deeply linked with their titles. These words, more often than not, relate to how the paper was produced and its purpose. They made way more sense when newspapers were more commonly actually made of paper, as opposed to today when most newspapers are more commonly read as words on a screen. After looking for a selection of repeating words in newspaper names, I realized that some of the most common ones were able to be split into 3 categories. One of those categories being words relating to how that newspaper was delivered to its readers. The delivery of newspapers is kind of a big deal. There's like a whole musical and video game about it, and many kids deliver newspapers as their first job. A really obvious example of a paper's name relating to delivery method has to be Post. Post features in paper names like the Washington Post or the New York Post. And for the record, me mentioning a paper here doesn't mean I endorse or oppose their views. I'm just using them as examples, and half the time I have no idea what their views actually are. Using Post in a newspaper's name heavily relates to how it was delivered. It was sent to people in the post/posted directly to them. Of course, this doesn't really make sense in today's news landscape, as not many people have the news posted to them. Yet the name has stuck around. Post is much more linked to British English today as the go-to word for things delivered to us. In American English, mail is far more popular, so it should come as no surprise to hear that mail is another one of those words linked with newspaper names too. This is most clearly seen in the paper of the Daily Mail here in the UK, but there's also the Accra Mail in Ghana and the Zambia Daily Mail in Zambia. This word of mail features in these names for the same reasons Post does too. What's interesting is that many of these mail-based names also feature the word daily too. Daily appears in a ton of paper names, and relates to the fact that there are new editions of this paper every day. A company or person who delivers things like newspapers is often referred to as a courier. This word comes from the Latin couriere, meaning to run, which relates to the idea that the first couriers weren't people in vans or even on horseback, but runners getting things from A to B as quick as possible on their own feet. I mention all of this as courier is yet again another one of those words that crops up all over the place in newspaper names. Take the Lincoln Courier, or the South Oxfordshire Courier, or even the Vancouver Courier. These names all fall into that category of names relating to how the paper was delivered. The final one of these of note I feel is dispatch. Dispatch can be used as a verb, meaning to send someone or something off to a specific destination, and in turn can also be used as a noun, as in a dispatch has been sent off. The word itself is of obscure origins. The dis prefix is commonly seen in words and means not/lack of, while the patch part is contentious. One idea is that it comes from Latin and means to entrap, which is fitting for dispatch as something that has been dispatched is definitely not trapped somewhere. Whatever the case, it's easy to understand how dispatch became a newspaper name off this trend of naming them after how they delivered. Many newspapers were dispatched directly to their readers. It's these delivery method of names that are perhaps the most odd in our current world, as so few people actually get newspapers dispatched to them in the post or mail by an actual courier. Yet these words live on in the names of newspaper websites websites. Thankfully, the other category still makes some sense in today's world. The second category I've lumped newspaper names into are the ones that relate to a newspaper being a record of events. That sounds really obvious, I know, as a newspaper is literally a record of events, but clearly some are more concerned with sharing that fact than others in their name. The most obvious of these being newspapers which feature the word news in their title. Papers like the Dallas Morning News, the Bangor Daily News, and the Birmingham News are prime examples of this. These kinds of names get straight to the point in regard to what these newspapers are all about. They're about reporting the news. This fits them into this category of being records of events because they are outright telling us in their name they are recording the news of that area. Another obvious name that indicates the newspaper is a record of events is the word record itself, seen in things like the York Daily Record or the North Jersey Record. Many of these other record of events style names relate to other kinds of books or things we use to record events into. Take the name of Chronicle, seen in the Plymouth Chronicle or Shrewsbury Chronicle. Chronicle is this word with real weight behind it. When many of us imagine a chronicle, we imagine a heavy tome of a book which goes into great detail about the history of its subject matter. Chronicles tend to deal with historical accounts and events which took place in a certain location, so it's understandable why the term will be applied to newspapers too, though I imagine the Chronicles of Plymouth aren't as exciting as the Chronicles of Narnia. It's okay, I'm allowed to make fun of Plymouth. I live here. A journal is similar to a chronicle, but more relates to one's private personal accounts, much like a diary. But journal is too seen in newspaper names, with the likes of the Daytona Beach News Journal in example. Bulletin is another word we see in paper names a lot. Take the Morning Bulletin, found in Australia. Bulletin is a word deeply linked with news, often news presented in short, bite-sized ways. Think of something like a bulletin board or a news bulletin in a television news show. The word unto itself has an interesting history. It comes from the Italian bulletta, which means voting slip, which in turn came from the Latin bulla, meaning round object, in relation to bulls used in Roman voting. That Italian bulletta, meaning voting slip, morphed into bulletin and came to refer to news in general. And yes, it's from this Latin bulla as to where we get bullet from too, hence why it sounds so similar to bulletin. Gazette is a word deeply linked with newspapers too. This one fits the idea of a paper being a record of events, as the word gazette literally means newspaper, so the London Gazette literally just means the London newspaper. The word once again comes from Italian and an old word they had for a type of coin, a halfpenny. This is because the papers originally costed a halfpenny to purchase. Using words like chronicle, journal, bulletin and gazette really tie into newspapers being physical, tangible records of information. One last one which falls into this record of events category meanwhile relates to something far less tangible, that being the name of Times. Times pops up in a lot of paper names, like there's one just called The Times, but also ones like the Seattle Times or the Times of India. Time isn't really something you can hold in your hand or turn the pages of like a journal or bulletin, but using the word Times in a paper's name still captures the concept that a newspaper is a record of events. It's an account of recent times in that part of the world, hence the use of the word in the paper's name. The first category is perhaps the most unique, and these are words which relate to large announcement or authority. I guess this could really be split into two categories, but I feel there's enough overlap to lump them together. Newspapers like to present themselves as all important and trusted sources of information, and a great way to do that is to use a word which gives them a higher sense of power for their readers. Think of words like Tribune, seen in the Chicago Tribune. Tribune began life as the name for a rank in ancient Rome's power system. It was the title given to the common person, aka plebeian, voting to represent their voice. From here, Tribune has come to relate to someone who is the voice of the masses, hence why newspapers like to use it. Herald is another one, like the Plymouth Herald. Yeah, I'm mentioning another Plymouth paper, hometown bias I suppose. A herald is someone who oversees big events or arrives prior to a big event, with an announcement of sorts. Once again, it makes sense why this will be used for newspapers. Sentinel pops up in paper names too, like with the Santa Cruz Sentinel. Sentinel is a term for a soldier, so it's somewhat odd to find in a paper's name. But once again, it relates to the idea of a paper being a sense of authority, and somewhat protecting you. This is the case with Guardian, which appears in newspaper names too, most obviously with just The Guardian. One that doesn't really relate to the title a human would have is Standard. Standard pops up in paper names with the likes of the London Standard. This relates to a paper wanting a sense of authority. Standard can mean something is the expected or the top of its class in some way, so a paper being dubbed a standard can be seen as it meaning the best of the best. Of course, not every newspaper name uses one of these words. There are some odder ones out there which which pop up in newspapers too. One I really like is Bee. There's a handful of papers which feature Bee in their name, like the Sacramento Bee or the Portland Bee. This comes from the idea that these papers are working on all sorts of things all around the clock like a busy worker bee. It's a really fun idea and shows us that a newspaper name doesn't have to be locked into the words covered in this video. Name Explain depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explain videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/Name Explain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm Name Explain YT and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and once again, thank you all so much.